You always make a mess. Just leave the kitchen alone. The words hit me like a slap across the face, delivered by my own daughter-in-law while my son sat silently on the couch, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, just please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep sharing these difficult truths. My name is Margaret Jennings, and I'm 78 years old. I was standing in the kitchen of what used to be my dream home in suburban Chicago, wearing the same floral apron I'd owned for 20 years. The one my late husband Harold always said made me look like a proper homemaker. My hands, weathered from decades of cooking and cleaning, were gripping a dish towel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The kitchen around me was pristine. Granite countertops that gleamed under the recessed lighting, stainless steel appliances that cost more than some people's cars, and a breakfast nook with windows that overlooked a perfectly manicured backyard. Everything was exactly as Marissa, my daughter-in-law, had designed it. Clean lines, neutral colors, not a single personal touch that belonged to me. I had just finished preparing Sunday dinner for the family, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the same recipe I'd been making for 50 years. The same meal that Harold used to say could solve any problem, heal any hurt. The kitchen smelled like home, like tradition, like the kind of love that takes hours to simmer and a lifetime to perfect. But Marissa stood behind me, her arms crossed, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon light streaming through those expensive windows. She was wearing one of her designer workout outfits, the kind that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. And her face wore that expression I'd grown to recognize and dread, the look that said I was an inconvenience, a burden, something to be tolerated rather than loved. "You always make a mess," she repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Just leave the kitchen alone." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, acrid and suffocating. I turned slowly, my arthritis protesting the movement, and looked at this woman who had somehow become the gatekeeper of my own family. Her green eyes held no warmth, no recognition of the hours I'd just spent preparing a meal for people I loved, no acknowledgement that this was the same kitchen where I'd taught her daughter, my granddaughter Rebecca, how to make chocolate chip cookies just last month. In the living room, I could see my son David lounging on the leather sectional we'd all picked out together 6 years ago. He was 34 years old, successful in his career as a financial advisor, and he looked so much like his father that sometimes it took my breath away. The same dark hair, the same strong jawline, the same hands that Harold used to use to hold mine during our evening walks around the neighborhood. But David's hands were busy scrolling through his phone, his attention completely absorbed by whatever digital world existed in that small screen. He didn't look up when Marissa spoke, didn't defend me, didn't even acknowledge that anything had been said at all. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled only by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of children playing in the backyard. Those were my grandchildren, Rebecca, who was 12 and still hugged me like she meant it, and little Tommy, who was 8 and loved when I read him stories before bed. They were the lights of my life, the reason I'd agreed to this arrangement in the first place. 6 years ago, when Harold passed away from the heart attack that took him while he was watering our tomato plants, David had come to me with what seemed like the perfect solution to my grief and loneliness. I was living in the small 2-bedroom condo where Harold and I had spent the last 15 years of our marriage. A cozy place with creaky floors and windows that didn't quite seal properly, but it was ours. Every corner held memories. The kitchen table where we'd shared 40 years of breakfast conversations, the armchair where Harold read his evening paper, the garden plot where we'd grown vegetables and argued playfully about the proper way to stake tomatoes. "Mom," David had said, sitting across from me at that familiar kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I'd made in the same pot I'd been using since 1985. "I've been thinking, Marissa and I want to buy a bigger house, and we'd love for you to be part of it. You could have your own room, your own bathroom, your own space. But you'd be with family. You wouldn't have to be alone." The idea had seemed like a gift from heaven. After 43 years of marriage, the silence in my little condo was deafening. I would sit at the kitchen table where Harold used to read me interesting articles from the newspaper, and the emptiness would press against my chest like a physical weight. I would cook dinner for one and remember all the times Harold would sneak into the kitchen to steal bites before the meal was ready, always claiming he was just testing for flavor. "We'd need help with the down payment," David had continued, his voice gentle but businesslike. "I know Dad left you well provided for, and we'd pay you back once we're established. It would be an investment for all of us, a place where the kids could have memories with their grandmother, where you'd never have to worry about being alone." I had $240,000 from Harold's pension and life insurance, money that was supposed to be my security blanket for whatever years I had left. But the thought of being surrounded by family again, of hearing children's laughter in the hallways and having someone to share holiday dinners with, was irresistible. I contributed $170,000 to their down payment. I packed up 40 years of memories, sold the condo where Harold and I had been happiest, and moved into what was supposed to be our family home. I brought my photo albums, hundreds of pictures documenting family vacations, birthday parties, graduations, and quiet moments that had seemed ordinary at the time but became precious after Harold was gone. I brought my rocking chair, the one Harold had surprised me with on our 20th anniversary, where I'd rocked both David and later my grandchildren to sleep. I brought my recipe box, filled with index cards stained with flour and love, recipes passed down from my mother and grandmother, dishes that told the story of our family's history. But slowly, carefully, systematically, I began to disappear. My rocking chair was moved to the garage because it didn't fit the aesthetic of the living room. My photo albums were relegated to a box in the basement because they cluttered the bookshelves. My recipes were dismissed as too old-fashioned when Marissa decided the family needed to eat more contemporary meals. The room that was supposed to be mine, a lovely space with an attached bathroom and a window that looked out onto the garden, gradually became a storage area for Christmas decorations, out-of-season clothes, and exercise equipment that no one ever used. I found myself sleeping on the pull-out couch in David's home office, surrounded by his business papers and the constant hum of his computer equipment. My personal belongings were condensed into 2 small boxes that I kept under the desk, like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. But I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that families take time to adjust, that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to look, and I made myself useful. I made myself indispensable because I thought that was the same as being loved. Every morning at 6:30, I would wake up on that uncomfortable pull-out couch, my back aching from the thin mattress and metal bars that pressed against my spine throughout the night. While the house still slept in peaceful silence, I would quietly fold away my bedding, transforming David's office back into a workspace before anyone could see the evidence of where I actually spent my nights. By 7 o'clock, I was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for a family that had grown accustomed to being served. Fresh coffee in the expensive machine Marissa had insisted we needed, pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse for Tommy, scrambled eggs just the way Rebecca liked them, and steel-cut oats for David because he was watching his cholesterol. I would pack their lunches with the care of someone who believed that love could be measured in perfectly cut sandwiches and handwritten notes tucked between the apple slices. Marissa would glide into the kitchen around 8:15, always perfectly dressed for whatever social engagement filled her day. Yoga class with the other neighborhood wives, lunch dates at restaurants I couldn't afford, shopping trips that lasted entire afternoons. She would pour herself coffee into a travel mug, grab the protein bar I'd laid out for her, and leave without so much as a thank you or good morning. "Don't forget to pick up Tommy from soccer at 4, she'd call over her shoulder, already checking her phone for text messages that were apparently more interesting than acknowledging the woman who'd been up for 2 hours making sure her day started smoothly. David would appear 30 minutes later, tie askew, briefcase in one hand and travel mug in the other. He moved through the kitchen like a man late for an important meeting with life itself, grabbing the breakfast I'd prepared and the lunch I'd packed without breaking stride toward the garage. "Thanks, Mom," he'd mumble, if I was lucky. More often than not, he was already on his phone, discussing client portfolios or market fluctuations with someone whose voice I could hear through the speaker, but whose face would never grace our dinner table. After they left, I would clean the kitchen, start a load of laundry, and begin planning dinner around whatever preferences and restrictions had been announced throughout the week. David couldn't eat too much red meat. Marissa was trying to eliminate gluten. Tommy refused anything green. Rebecca was going through a phase where she only wanted simple foods, which apparently meant I needed to cook elaborate meals and then pick out any ingredients that looked weird to her 12-year-old eyes. The grocery shopping became an exercise in careful mathematics. I would take the bus to 3 different stores, comparing prices and clipping coupons with the determination of someone trying to feed a family on a fixed income that kept shrinking. My Social Security check covered my personal needs, medications, a few items of clothing when absolutely necessary, the occasional book from the library's used sale. But I found myself contributing more and more to the household expenses that David and Marissa somehow couldn't manage, despite their combined income being 3 times what Harold and I had ever earned. "Mom, could you cover the electric bill this month?" David would ask, standing in the doorway of his office while I folded laundry on the couch that doubled as my bed. We had some unexpected expenses come up. The unexpected expenses were always things like new outdoor furniture for the patio, weekend getaways to expensive hotels, or Marissa's latest business venture that required startup costs but never seemed to generate actual income. I covered the electric bill, and the water bill, and the internet bill because the kids need it for homework. I paid for piano lessons when Rebecca showed interest in music, even though the piano sat in the living room collecting dust after 3 months. I covered Tommy's baseball registration fees, the cost of his uniform, and the team photos that no one ever looked at after picture day. When Marissa decided she wanted to reinvent herself professionally, I paid for her online marketing course. $800 for 12 weeks of video lessons that she completed during what she called her morning inspiration time, the same hours when I was scrubbing toilets and vacuuming floors that she walked across without noticing the work that kept them clean. "You're so generous, Mom," David would say when I handed him another check. "We'll pay you back once things settle down." But things never settled down. Instead, they escalated. The family vacations that I helped fund, but wasn't invited to join. "It's really more of a couple's trip," Marissa would explain, showing me pictures on her phone of the resort in Cancun, where they'd spent a week while I house sat and took care of their neighbor's cat. "You understand, right? All that sun and activity wouldn't be good for someone your age." I was 73 at the time. Harold and I had hiked through national parks until he was 78. The birthday parties for the grandchildren where I was relegated to kitchen duty, while Marissa's friends and their children enjoyed the celebrations I'd helped plan and finance. I would spend hours preparing food, decorating cakes, and wrapping presents, only to watch through the kitchen window as other adults received credit for the party's success. "Grandma Margaret made the cake," Rebecca announced proudly at her 10th birthday party, and I felt a warm surge of recognition that lasted exactly until Marissa corrected her. "Actually, honey, Mommy ordered that cake from the bakery. Grandma just picked it up." I had spent 6 hours baking and decorating a 3-layer chocolate cake with Rebecca's favorite flowers made from buttercream frosting. The bakery cake sat untouched in the refrigerator while the children devoured my creation, but the credit went to someone else's convenience store transaction. The doctor's appointments that I attended alone because David was swamped at work, and Marissa had prior commitments. When I was diagnosed with mild diabetes, I sat in the physician's office by myself, listening to dietary restrictions and medication schedules that I would need to manage without support from the family I'd moved in to be closer to. "How's your support system at home?" Dr. Patterson asked, reviewing my test results with the gentle concern of someone who'd been treating elderly patients for decades. "It's fine," I lied, because admitting the truth would have meant acknowledging what I wasn't ready to face yet. The evenings when I would sit at the kitchen table, paying bills with money that should have been securing my own future, while David and Marissa watched television in the living room, they would discuss their days, their plans, their concerns about work and social obligations, speaking in the intimate shorthand of 2 people building a life together. I would listen from the kitchen, feeling like an outsider eavesdropping on conversations that occasionally referenced me in the third person. "Your mom left the porch light on again," Marissa would complain. "It's wasteful." "I'll talk to her," David would reply. as if I were a problematic tenant rather than his mother who had contributed more to their household than they'd ever contributed to mine. The grandchildren became my lifeline and my heartbreak simultaneously. Rebecca would curl up next to me on the couch after school, telling me about her day while I helped her with homework that her parents were too busy to review. Tommy would climb onto my lap during Saturday morning cartoons, his small body warm and trusting against mine in ways that reminded me of when David had been that age. But even my relationships with the children were filtered through Marissa's control. When I offered to take them to the zoo, she worried about my ability to keep up with them. When I suggested teaching Rebecca how to knit, Marissa explained that they were trying to limit screen time alternatives to encourage more outdoor activity. When Tommy asked if I could read him bedtime stories like I used to, Marissa redirected him toward audiobooks that would help develop his independent listening skills. I was being managed, handled, controlled in ways that were presented as care, but felt increasingly like imprisonment. The breaking point should have come months before that Sunday afternoon in the kitchen. It should have come when I realized I was paying for groceries that others decided I wasn't qualified to prepare. It should have come when my bedroom was reassigned without consultation. It should have come when I found myself apologizing for existing in spaces that my money had helped create. But I kept hoping that sacrifice would eventually be rewarded with the love I remembered from when David was young. When he would run to me with skinned knees and hurt feelings, when I was the person who could fix anything with a bandage and a hug. I kept believing that if I just gave enough, contributed enough, made myself useful enough, I would earn my place in this family I'd helped build and finance. I was wrong. Was I used? The question formed in my mind like a bubble rising to the surface of water, demanding to be acknowledged even when I wanted to push it back down into the depths where uncomfortable truths lived. The answer was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. The cruelest wounds weren't the obvious ones. They were the 1,000 tiny cuts that came disguised as casual comments, forgotten moments, and deliberate oversights that made me question my own worth. My 77th birthday passed without acknowledgement. I woke up that Tuesday morning on the pull-out couch, my joints protesting as I transformed David's office back into a workspace, and waited for someone to remember. Harold had always made my birthdays feel special. Breakfast in bed, a small gift he'd hidden somewhere in the house for me to find, dinner at our favorite restaurant where the waiters knew our names and our usual orders. I made breakfast for everyone as usual, served coffee and packed lunches, cleaned up the kitchen while Marissa checked her social media, and David reviewed client files on his laptop. The day proceeded like any other, with the weight of my invisible birthday pressing against my chest like a stone. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I heard Marissa on the phone with her sister, laughing about some friend's elaborate birthday celebration. 35 years old and acting like she's turning 16. Marissa giggled. Some women just can't accept aging gracefully. I was standing at the stove, stirring pasta sauce that had been simmering for 2 hours, and I realized that my birthday would pass completely unnoticed. Not because they'd forgotten. I'd mentioned it the week before when David asked about upcoming calendar events. They simply didn't consider it worth acknowledging. 2 weeks later, I woke up with flu symptoms that made every muscle in my body ache and left me dizzy when I tried to stand. Instead of staying in bed, I forced myself to make breakfast because no one else would ensure the children ate before school. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, holding onto counters for support, while I prepared meals for people who would have noticed immediately if their coffee wasn't ready or their lunch wasn't packed. "You look terrible," Marissa observed, not with concern, but with the mild irritation of someone whose routine might be disrupted. "Try not to get the kids sick." David glanced up from his phone long enough to add, "Maybe you should rest today." But he still expected his breakfast and his perfectly ironed shirt for the client meeting he'd mentioned 3 times that morning. I spent the day moving between the couch and the kitchen, preparing dinner despite a fever that made the room spin around me. When the family sat down to eat the chicken and rice I'd somehow managed to cook, David mentioned that his colleague's mother had been hospitalized with pneumonia. "That's the problem with elderly people," Marissa said, cutting her chicken into precise squares. "They don't take care of themselves properly." I was sitting right there, clearly ill, clearly struggling, and she spoke about elderly people as if I were furniture that couldn't hear or feel the sting of her words. The photographs disappeared gradually, so slowly that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. The family portrait from Rebecca's communion, where I stood proudly beside my granddaughter in her white dress, moved from the mantel to a drawer. The vacation photos from the last trip Harold and I had taken together, displayed in the hallway for years, relocated to make room for more current pictures. When I asked David about the missing photos, he explained that Marissa was updating the decor to reflect their evolving aesthetic preferences. But those are family memories, I protested gently. Of course, Mom. We're not throwing them away. They're in the album in the basement. You can look at them anytime you want. The basement, where old things went to be forgotten. The day I discovered the truth about my financial contributions, I wasn't even looking for evidence of betrayal. I was simply trying to help Rebecca with a school project about family budgets when she asked how much it cost to run our household. I don't know, honey, I admitted. Grandpa David handles all that. Rebecca, with the innocent curiosity of a 12-year-old who hadn't yet learned that some questions made adults uncomfortable, suggested we could ask him when he got home. But then she remembered seeing papers on his desk that had numbers and dollar signs, and maybe we could use those for her project. David's office, where I slept every night, was normally off limits during the day, but Rebecca was his daughter, and this was for school. And surely he wouldn't mind us looking at basic household information for educational purposes. The file folder labeled Household Expenses sat prominently on his desk, organized with the same meticulous attention to detail that David brought to his professional work. Rebecca opened it with the confidence of a child who'd never been told she couldn't touch her father's things. What I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. A spreadsheet, printed and updated monthly, showing every financial contribution I'd made to their household over the past 6 years. My initial $170,000 down payment was listed as M. Jennings loan to be repaid. But beneath that, in smaller font, were hundreds of additional entries. Electric bill, $127, M. Jennings. Water bill, $89, M. Jennings. Tommy's baseball registration, $150, M. Jennings. Rebecca's piano lessons, $320, M. Jennings. Marissa's business course, $800, M. Jennings. Line after line after line, documenting every check I'd written, every bill I'd covered, every expense I'd absorbed because they claimed they were temporarily short or had unexpected costs. The total at the bottom of the page made me grip the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned white. $247,000. I had contributed nearly $250,000 to this household over 6 years. Not including groceries, not including the countless meals I prepared, not including the free childcare and housekeeping services I provided daily. But the most devastating discovery was in a separate column, marked Reimbursements. Every line was blank except for one small note at the bottom, to be addressed when financially feasible. Rebecca looked up at me with innocent eyes. Grandma, why does this say you gave Daddy almost $250,000? That's more money than most people have in their whole lives. I couldn't answer her. I couldn't speak at all. Hidden behind David's filing cabinet, I found a folder marked Real Estate Planning. Inside were documents I'd never seen before, appraisals, refinancing papers, and a financial advisor's report that discussed the house as David and Marissa's primary asset for retirement planning. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere. The house that I'd helped purchase, that my money had made possible, was being treated as their exclusive property in every legal and financial document. The equity I'd helped build was calculated as their net worth. The future sale of the property was projected as their retirement security. I had been erased from the financial picture as completely as I'd been erased from the family photographs. That evening, as I prepared dinner with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, I listened to David and Marissa discuss their weekend plans. They were going to visit her parents, who lived in a beautiful retirement community about 3 hours away. Mom's making her famous lasagna for Sunday dinner, Marissa said, scrolling through her phone while I stood 10 feet away, stirring sauce for the meal they would eat that night. She's so excited to see the kids again. Marissa's mother was 68 years old, 9 years younger than me. She lived in her own apartment, maintained her independence, and was treated with the respect and inclusion that I'd somehow lost without realizing it. "What about your mom?" Marissa asked David, gesturing vaguely in my direction without actually looking at me. "I suppose she'll want to come too." "Actually," David said, his voice careful in the way that indicated a difficult conversation was coming. "I think it might be better if Mom stays home this weekend. Your parents' guest room only has one bed, and with the kids' schedules—" He continued talking, manufacturing reasonable excuses for why including me in family visits was complicated and inconvenient. I stood at the stove, invisible and disposable, listening to them plan a family gathering that would happen without me. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the financial documents spread before me like evidence in a courtroom. The numbers told a story I'd been too trusting to see, too hopeful to acknowledge. I wasn't David's mother living with his family. I was their financial benefactor who happened to be related to them by blood. I wasn't Marissa's mother-in-law contributing to household harmony. I was an ATM with emotions that occasionally interfered with smooth transactions. The dish towel from that terrible Sunday was still folded in the drawer where I'd put it, and I pulled it out now, holding it against my chest like a talisman. The fabric smelled like the lemon dish soap I'd been using for 40 years, like the kitchen routine that had once brought me satisfaction and now felt like evidence of my own exploitation. "You always make a mess." The words echoed in my mind with new meaning now. I wasn't just messy in the kitchen. I was messy with my expectations of love and respect. I was messy with my belief that family meant something more than financial convenience. I was messy with my assumption that generosity would be met with gratitude rather than entitlement. I looked around the kitchen that my money had helped renovate, in the house that my down payment had made possible, surrounded by appliances and furniture that I'd contributed to purchasing but had no claim to owning. For the first time in 6 years, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my rage. Not the polite disappointment I'd been carrying, not the quiet hurt I'd been swallowing, the pure, clean fury of someone who had been systematically deceived and exploited by people who were supposed to love her. I folded the dish towel with deliberate precision and placed it back in the drawer. Tomorrow, I would begin cleaning up the mess I'd made, but not in the kitchen. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 6 years. I didn't make breakfast. I woke up at my usual time, folded the pull-out couch with the same careful precision I'd practiced for years, but instead of heading to the kitchen to begin my daily service routine, I sat in David's desk chair and stared at the financial documents that had shattered my illusions the night before. At 7:15, I heard Marissa's footsteps on the hardwood floor, moving toward the kitchen with the confident stride of someone who expected her morning coffee to be waiting exactly as it had been every day for 6 years. The silence that followed was almost musical. "David!" Marissa's voice carried through the house with sharp-edged panic. "David, get down here!" I listened to the chaos unfold from behind the closed office door, footsteps running downstairs, cabinet doors slamming, the angry beep of the coffee machine being operated by someone who had never learned how to use it properly. "Where is she?" David's voice, groggy with sleep and rising with confusion. "I don't know, but there's no coffee, no breakfast, nothing. The kids need to eat before school, and I have that meeting with the school board at 9. Tommy appeared in the hallway, still in his pajamas, looking lost and confused. "Where's Grandma Margaret? I'm hungry." "I don't know, sweetie," Marissa replied, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining maternal composure while clearly panicking about her disrupted morning routine. "Why don't you get some cereal?" "But Grandma always makes pancakes on Mondays." Rebecca joined her brother in the hallway, already dressed for school, but moving with the uncertainty of a child whose routine had been suddenly altered. "Is Grandma sick again? Should we check on her?" I heard David's footsteps approaching the office door, and I braced myself for the conversation I'd been avoiding for 6 years. "Mom?" He knocked gently, his voice carrying the patient tone he used with difficult clients. "Are you okay in there? Marissa's wondering about breakfast." I opened the door slowly, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that surprised us both. "I'm fine, David. I'm just not making breakfast today." His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, mild annoyance, and then something that might have been actual concern. "Are you feeling all right? You never miss breakfast." "I'm feeling very clear-headed, actually." I held up the financial documents, watching his face pale as he recognized them. We need to talk. Marissa appeared behind him, holding a travel mug filled with coffee that looked weak and bitter. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled, and her usual morning composure had cracked around the edges. Margaret, I don't know what's gotten into you, but the children need to eat, and I have an important meeting. The children can have cereal, I interrupted, my voice calm but firm, and you can stop at Starbucks on your way to your meeting. We have more pressing matters to discuss. David stepped into the office, his eyes fixed on the papers in my hands. Mom, I can explain. I'm sure you can. You've always been very good with explanations. I set the documents on his desk, spreading them out like evidence in a trial. $247,000, David. That's what I've contributed to this household beyond my original down payment. Marissa pushed past David, her face flushing red as she saw the spreadsheets. You went through our private financial documents? That's a violation of what exactly? I asked, standing up slowly, feeling my full height for the first time in years. My privacy? My trust? My assumption that when I give money to family, I'm helping rather than being systematically exploited. The word exploited hung in the air like a thunderclap. David flinched as if I'd slapped him. Mom, it's not like that. You know we're grateful for everything you've done. Grateful? I laughed, and the sound surprised all of us. It wasn't bitter or angry. It was clear and strong and utterly without apology. David, when was the last time you thanked me for anything? When was the last time you included me in a family decision? When was the last time you treated me like a person, rather than a convenient source of funding? Rebecca and Tommy had gathered in the doorway, their young faces serious as they watched their grandmother face down their parents with a strength they'd never seen before. Marissa's composure cracked completely. We never asked you to pay for everything. You offered. You said you wanted to help. I did want to help. I wanted to be part of a family. But helping and being used are two very different things. I picked up the real estate documents, the ones that had my name completely omitted from the future plans. Tell me, Marissa, when you and David discussed selling this house for your retirement, do you ever mention that my money made the purchase possible? David's face went ashen. Mom, those are just preliminary planning documents. Planning documents that treat this house as exclusively yours. Planning documents that calculate my contributions as your assets. Planning documents that erase me from the equity I helped create. Rebecca stepped forward, her 12-year-old voice small but clear. Grandma, are you going to leave? The question stopped everyone cold. In her innocent way, Rebecca had identified the heart of what we were all dancing around, the possibility that their financial security blanket might finally stand up for herself. I looked at my granddaughter, this beautiful child who still hugged me like she meant it, who still asked for bedtime stories, who had never learned to treat me with the casual dismissal that her parents had perfected. I don't know yet, sweetheart, but I'm going to stop pretending that giving away my self-respect is the same thing as loving my family. Tommy moved closer to Rebecca, sensing tension he was too young to understand but old enough to fear. Did we do something wrong, Grandma? No, baby. You didn't do anything wrong. I knelt down to his level, ignoring the protest from my arthritic knees. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about how to treat people they love, and sometimes it takes a long time to figure out how to fix those mistakes. David found his voice again, but it came out strained and defensive. Mom, I think you're overreacting. Every family has financial arrangements that seem complicated from the outside. From the outside? I stood back up, meeting his eyes directly. David, I live here. I see exactly how this family operates. I see who contributes and who takes. I see who shows up for every obligation and who gets included in every benefit. Marissa tried a different approach, her voice dropping to the concerned tone she used when she wanted something. Margaret, I think maybe you're feeling overlooked, and that's understandable. We could do better about including you in family activities. Include me? The laugh came again, stronger this time. Marissa, yesterday I stood in this kitchen, sick with fever, preparing dinner for people who couldn't be bothered to ask how I was feeling. Last week, David discussed his financial future with his advisor while sitting 5 feet away from the woman who's funding that future. I'm not looking for inclusion. I'm looking for basic human dignity. The room fell silent except for the sound of the coffee maker finishing its cycle and the distant hum of morning traffic outside. The children looked between their parents and their grandmother, sensing that something fundamental was shifting in their family dynamic. David tried once more, his voice taking on the negotiating tone he used in business. Okay, you're right. We've been taking you for granted, and that's not fair. What do you want us to do differently? It was the wrong question, delivered in the wrong tone, at exactly the wrong moment. I want you to stop treating me like a problem to be managed, I said quietly. I want you to stop acting like my contributions are obligations you're entitled to, rather than gifts you should appreciate. And I want you to start behaving like you remember that I'm your mother, not your employee. Marissa's face flushed deeper red. That's not fair. We never treated you like an employee. Really? I gestured around the office where I slept, where my belongings were crammed into 2 small boxes, where I had no privacy and no space that belonged to me. When's the last time you asked my opinion about anything that affects this household? When's the last time you considered my preferences when making family plans? When's the last time you acted like my presence was wanted rather than merely tolerated? The questions hung in the air unanswered because we all knew there were no good answers. Rebecca stepped forward again, her young face troubled. Grandma, we want you here. We love you. I know you do, sweetheart. And I love you too. More than you'll ever know. I reached out and touched her cheek gently. But love isn't just a feeling. It's also how we treat people. And sometimes people who love each other still hurt each other without meaning to. David and Marissa exchanged glances, and I could see them calculating, trying to figure out how to contain this situation before it spiraled beyond their control. Mom, David said carefully, why don't we all take some time to cool down and then discuss this rationally when everyone's had a chance to think? I've had 6 years to think, David. I'm done thinking. I walked past them toward the kitchen, feeling their eyes on my back as I moved with purpose for the first time in years. Where are you going? Marissa called after me. To make breakfast for my grandchildren, I replied without turning around. And then I'm going to make some phone calls. What kind of phone calls? David's voice carried a note of panic. I stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked back at them. My son, who looked so much like his father but had somehow failed to inherit Harold's kindness, and my daughter-in-law, who had never learned that taking was not the same as receiving, the kind that people make when they're tired of being taken for granted. As I began preparing pancakes for Rebecca and Tommy, I could hear David and Marissa whispering urgently in the hallway, their voices carrying the desperate undertones of people who had just realized that their comfortable arrangement might be coming to an end. For the first time in 6 years, I was in control of the conversation. The phone calls I made that Tuesday morning changed everything. After David and Marissa left for work, their departure more hurried and tense than usual, I sat at the kitchen table with the house phone in my hands and a piece of paper where I'd written down 3 numbers. The first was for Harold's lawyer, Mr. Howard, who had handled our estate planning for 30 years. The second was for the bank where my remaining savings were held in an account that only I controlled. The third was for a locksmith I'd found in the yellow pages. But before I made those calls, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I called my sister Eleanor in Phoenix. Eleanor was 5 years older than me, widowed like me, but she'd made very different choices after her husband passed away. Instead of moving in with family, she'd sold her house in Michigan and bought a small condo in a retirement community where she played bridge twice a week, took painting classes, and went on organized trips to places she'd always wanted to see. Margaret? Her voice was surprised but warm when she answered on the second ring. Is everything all right? You never call during the day. I'm calling because I need to hear what my life could sound like if I made different choices. There was a pause, and then Eleanor's voice became gentler. Oh, honey. What's happened? I told her everything. Not the sanitized version I'd been telling myself for 6 years, but the raw truth about financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, and the slow erosion of my dignity in a house where I'd thought I'd find love and security. Eleanor listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, she said finally, do you remember what you told me when Charles died, and I was thinking about moving in with Jennifer and her family? I did remember. 7 years ago, When Eleanor was struggling with loneliness and considering giving up her independence to live with her daughter in Chicago, I'd been the one to counsel her against it. I told you that moving in with adult children was almost always a mistake, that it changes the relationship in ways that hurt everyone involved. You told me that being someone's burden wasn't the same as being someone's blessing. You told me that I deserved to live as myself, not as an appendage to someone else's life. The irony of giving advice I'd been unable to follow myself wasn't lost on me. Why didn't you take your own counsel? Eleanor asked gently. Because I was scared. Because after Harold died, the silence in my house felt like it was going to swallow me whole. Because David made it sound like I'd be gaining a family instead of losing myself. And what do you know now that you didn't know then? I looked around the kitchen where I'd spent 6 years making meals for people who rarely thanked me, in a house where I had no real place, surrounded by appliances I'd helped buy but had no claim to own. I know that loneliness with dignity is better than companionship without respect. Good, Eleanor said firmly. Now what are you going to do about it? My first call was to Mr. Howard, whose secretary remembered me and put me through immediately. Mrs. Jennings? His familiar voice carried the warmth of someone who'd known Harold and me when we were young and full of plans. How are you managing? I need to understand my legal rights regarding the house I'm living in, I said without preamble. And I need to know how to protect what's left of my financial assets. Mr. Howard listened carefully as I explained the situation, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the financial arrangements and the lack of written agreements governing my contributions to David's household. Margaret, he said when I finished, I'm going to be very direct with you. From a legal standpoint, you've been remarkably generous to the point of financial vulnerability. Since there are no written agreements specifying repayment terms or conditions, your contributions could be classified as gifts rather than loans. The word gifts hit me like a physical blow. $250,000 in gifts to people who treated my presence like an inconvenience. However, Mr. Howard continued, you do have options. Your remaining assets are substantial enough to secure your independence, and there are legal ways to protect them from further generosity. What kind of legal ways? Trust arrangements that would prevent you from making large financial gifts without oversight. Formal loan agreements that would establish clear repayment terms if you choose to continue supporting your family financially. And certainly, documentation that would protect any future living arrangements you might make. He paused, and I could hear him shuffling papers on his desk. Margaret, may I ask what you're planning to do? I'm planning to remember that I'm a 77-year-old woman with enough money to live independently and enough life left to live it on my own terms. Good for you, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. When would you like to come in to discuss the details? My second call was to the bank, where I spoke with a financial advisor who reviewed my accounts and confirmed what I already knew. Despite my substantial contributions to David's household, I still had enough savings to live comfortably for the rest of my life, as long as I stopped funding other people's dreams at the expense of my own security. Mrs. Jennings, the advisor said, would you like me to arrange for any additional protections on your accounts? Sometimes family members have access to financial information that might be used inappropriately. I thought about David's detailed spreadsheets, his casual assumption that my money was available for his family's needs, his complete absence of any plan to repay what he'd already taken. Yes, I said firmly. I want to set up new accounts that only I can access, and I want to transfer my assets there immediately. The third call was to the locksmith, who could come that afternoon to change the locks on the small storage unit where I'd been keeping Harold's tools and some furniture that wouldn't fit in David's house. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I wanted to make sure it stayed that way. But the most important call was one I almost didn't make. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived 3 houses down, had been Harold's friend for 20 years. She was 81 years old, sharp as a tack, and lived alone in a beautiful Victorian house that she maintained with the help of a handyman who came twice a week. I'd always admired her independence, her garden, and the way she seemed to have created a life that was entirely her own. When she answered the phone, her voice was bright and curious. Margaret, what a lovely surprise. How are you, dear? I'm having the worst and best day I've had in years, I said honestly. And I'm wondering if you might have time for a cup of tea this afternoon. Of course, I'll put the kettle on. Are you all right? I'm going to be, I said, and realized as I spoke the words that I believed them. That afternoon, I walked the 3 blocks to Mrs. Chen's house, carrying a small overnight bag with my medications, a change of clothes, and the financial documents that had opened my eyes to my own exploitation. Mrs. Chen's house smelled like lavender and lemon oil, and her living room was filled with books, plants, and photographs of the trips she'd taken since her husband died 15 years earlier. She served tea in delicate china cups and listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that some stories needed to be told completely before they could be properly understood. When I finished explaining my situation, she set down her teacup and looked at me with clear, intelligent eyes. "How can I help?" she asked simply. "I need somewhere to stay for a few days while I figure out what comes next. I'll pay you, of course." She held up her hand to stop me. "Margaret, I have 4 bedrooms in this house and no one to share them with except when my grandson visits twice a year. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, and the only payment I'll accept is your company." That evening, as I sat in Mrs. Chen's guest room, a sunny space with its own bathroom, a comfortable reading chair, and windows that looked out onto her rose garden, I called David to inform him that I wouldn't be coming home that night. "Mom, what's going on? Where are you?" "I'm staying with a friend, and I'm taking some time to think about what I want my life to look like going forward." "This is ridiculous." Marissa's voice came through the phone. David must have put me on speaker. "You can't just disappear because you're upset about this morning." "I'm not upset, Marissa. I'm done. There's a difference." "Done with what?" David asked, his voice tight with worry. "Done pretending that financial exploitation is family love. Done accepting crumbs of respect from people who should be offering me full portions. Done living like a grateful guest in a house my money helped purchase. Mom, come home. We'll talk about this rationally." "I am home," I said quietly. "For the first time in 6 years, I'm somewhere I'm wanted for who I am, not what I can provide." I hung up before they could respond. That night, I slept in a real bed, in a room where my belongings fit in the dresser, where no one would convert my space into storage when I wasn't looking, where the silence was peaceful rather than oppressive. For the first time in years, I didn't set an alarm clock. For the first time in years, I didn't plan breakfast for people who had forgotten how to say thank you. For the first time in years, I woke up excited to see what the day would bring. Mrs. Chen was already in her kitchen when I came downstairs, reading the newspaper with a cup of coffee and a piece of toast with homemade jam. "Good morning, dear," she said, looking up with a smile. "How did you sleep?" "Like someone who remembers she has choices," I replied. And for the first time in 6 years, I meant every word. They gave me exactly 4 days before the desperation set in. 4 days of sleeping peacefully in Mrs. Chen's guest room, of morning coffee without obligations, of conversations that didn't revolve around what I could provide for someone else. 4 days of rediscovering what it felt like to be valued for my company rather than my contributions. On Friday morning, as I sat in Mrs. Chen's garden reading a book I'd borrowed from her extensive library, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Grandma Margaret?" Rebecca's voice was small and uncertain. "It's me." My heart clenched. Of all the weapons they could have chosen, my granddaughter was the cruelest and most effective. "Hello, sweetheart. How are you?" I'm okay. But Grandma, everyone's really upset, and Mom and Dad are fighting a lot, and Tommy keeps asking when you're coming home." I closed the book and leaned back in the comfortable garden chair Mrs. Chen had positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun. "Rebecca, honey, are you calling me because you want to, or because someone asked you to?" There was a pause that told me everything I needed to know. Mom said maybe if I talked to you, you'd understand how much we miss you. And what do you think, Rebecca? Do you miss me? Or do you miss the things I used to do for you?" Another pause. Longer this time. Rebecca was 12 years old, but she was smart enough to understand the difference between missing a person and missing their services. "I miss you," she said finally, and I believed her. "But Grandma, why can't you just come home? Why does everything have to be so complicated?" "Because sometimes, sweetheart, adults have to make difficult choices to protect themselves. And sometimes love means setting boundaries, even when it's hard." "I don't understand." "I know you don't. And that's okay. But Rebecca, I need you to promise me something. Promise me that no matter what happens between me and your parents, you'll remember that I love you and Tommy more than anything in this world. Can you promise me that? I promise, she whispered, and I could hear tears in her voice. Good. Now, put your mother on the phone. She's right here, Rebecca admitted. I know she is, honey. It's okay. Marissa's voice came through the phone with barely controlled panic. Margaret, this has gone on long enough. The children are confused. David is falling apart, and you're being incredibly selfish. The word selfish nearly made me laugh. After 6 years of funding their lifestyle, caring for their children, and sacrificing my independence for their convenience, I was being called selfish for finally standing up for myself. I'm being selfish? I asked calmly. Marissa, when was the last time you did something for me that didn't ultimately benefit you? That's not the point. The point is that you're part of this family, and families don't just abandon each other when things get difficult. You're absolutely right. Families don't abandon each other. They also don't exploit each other, dismiss each other, or take each other for granted. So, which one of us has been behaving like family, Marissa? Margaret, please. Just come home. We can work this out. I am home, I said, repeating the words that had ended our last conversation. But, if you want to have a real conversation about our family dynamics, I'm willing to meet with all of you. Tonight, 7 o'clock, at the library on Maple Street. The library? Why not here at the house? Because the house represents everything that's wrong with our relationship. The library is neutral territory. I hung up before she could argue. That evening, I arrived at the library 15 minutes early and chose a table in the quiet section near the back, where we could talk without disturbing other patrons. I dressed carefully, not in the casual clothes I'd been wearing for the past 4 days, but in the navy blue dress Harold had always said made me look distinguished. I'd styled my gray hair and even put on lipstick, small acts of self-care that felt like armor against whatever emotional manipulation was coming. David arrived first, looking haggard in a way that might have concerned me a week ago, but now simply confirmed that he was finally experiencing consequences for his actions. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his shirt looked like he'd slept in it. Mom, he said, sliding into the chair across from me. Thank God you're okay. We've been worried sick. Have you? I asked mildly. Or have you been worried about who's going to cover the electric bill this month? He flinched as if I'd slapped him. That's not fair. Fair? I opened the folder I'd brought with me, pulling out copies of the financial documents that had opened my eyes to the reality of our relationship. David, let's talk about what's fair. Marissa arrived with Rebecca and Tommy in tow, her face set in the determined expression of someone preparing for battle. She'd dressed the children carefully, Rebecca in the dress I'd bought her for school pictures, Tommy in the button-down shirt I'd given him for his birthday. Another manipulation tactic, reminding me of my emotional investment in their lives. But she'd also brought something I hadn't expected, a manila folder of her own. Before we start, Marissa said, settling into her chair with the confidence of someone who believed she held winning cards. I think you should see something. She slid a document across the table toward me. It was a printout from a legal website, highlighted in yellow marker with a section circled in red ink. Illinois state law regarding elder financial abuse, she announced, as if she were a lawyer presenting evidence in court. Did you know that family members who take advantage of elderly relatives can face criminal charges? I looked at the document, then back at her face, which was flushed with the satisfaction of someone who thought she'd just delivered a knockout blow. Marissa, I said quietly, are you threatening me with legal action? I'm just pointing out that there are laws protecting elderly people from being manipulated or coerced into making financial decisions they might not fully understand. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the whispered conversations of other library patrons several tables away. David's face had gone white. Marissa, what are you doing? I'm protecting our family, she said firmly. Margaret is clearly not thinking rationally. She's making impulsive decisions that could harm everyone, including herself. I folded my hands on top of the table and looked at this woman who had just threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent for refusing to continue funding her lifestyle. "That's interesting," I said conversationally. "David, did you know your wife was planning to question my mental capacity?" "Mom, we didn't discuss this," David stammered, shooting furious glances at Marissa. "It's okay," I said, pulling out my own documents, "because I've been having some very interesting conversations with lawyers myself." I spread the papers across the table with deliberate precision. Bank statements showing my protected assets. Legal documents establishing my mental competency as verified by Dr. Patterson, my physician of 15 years. And most importantly, a detailed accounting of every financial contribution I'd made to their household, prepared by Mr. Howard's office with the thoroughness of someone anticipating exactly this kind of confrontation. "According to Illinois state law," I said, reading from my own highlighted document, "elder financial abuse includes the illegal or improper use of an elder's funds, property, or assets. It includes situations where family members use emotional manipulation to obtain money or property from elderly relatives under false pretenses." Marissa's face had gone from flushed to pale. "Now," I continued, "which one of us do you think has a stronger case for elder abuse? The 77-year-old woman who stopped giving money to people who don't respect her, or the family members who have accepted nearly $250,000 from that woman while systematically excluding her from the family life she was paying to be part of?" David found his voice, but it came out strangled. "Mom, we didn't realize." "You didn't realize you were taking advantage of me?" I asked. "Or you didn't realize I would ever stand up for myself?" Tommy, who had been sitting quietly beside his mother, suddenly spoke up. "Are you going to call the police on us, Grandma?" His innocent question cut through the legal posturing and threats like a knife through fog. I looked at this little boy who had never asked for any of this, who loved me simply and completely, who was now frightened because the adults in his life were too busy fighting to protect him from their dysfunction. "No, sweetheart," I said gently. "I'm not going to call the police. I'm just going to stop giving money to people who don't appreciate it." "But what about our house?" Rebecca asked, her voice small and worried. "Mom and Dad said we might have to move if you don't help anymore." I looked across the table at David and Marissa, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since Harold died. Two people who had built their financial security on the foundation of my generosity, and were now panicking because that foundation was being removed. "Rebecca," I said carefully, "your parents are both adults with good jobs and the ability to pay their own bills. If they've been depending on my money instead of learning to live within their means, that's not your fault, and it's not your responsibility to fix." I stood up slowly, gathering my documents with the same deliberate care I'd used to spread them out. "I want all of you to listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally remembered her own worth. "I will no longer be contributing financially to this household. I will no longer be providing free childcare, housekeeping, or meal preparation services. I will no longer be accepting treatment that makes me feel like a burden rather than a blessing." I looked directly at David, this son who looked so much like his father but had forgotten Harold's lessons about treating people with dignity. "If you want a relationship with me going forward, it will be based on mutual respect and genuine affection, not on what I can provide for you." I turned to Marissa, who was staring at me with the shock of someone whose primary manipulation tactic had just backfired spectacularly. "And if you ever again suggest that I'm mentally incompetent for refusing to be exploited, I will let my lawyer handle all future communications with you." Finally, I knelt down between Rebecca and Tommy, taking their small hands in mine. "I love you both more than you will ever know," I said, my voice soft but clear. "And that love is not conditional on whether your parents treat me well. But the way I allow myself to be treated is a lesson for you about how people should value each other. I hope someday you'll understand that." I kissed each of their foreheads and walked toward the library exit, leaving my family sitting in stunned silence among the scattered documents that told the story of 6 years of misplaced generosity and systematic disrespect. At the door, I turned back one last time. "When you're ready to apologize, really apologize, not just apologize for getting caught, you know where to find me." I walked out into the cool evening air, feeling lighter than I had in years. 3 weeks after the library confrontation, I did something I hadn't done in 43 years of marriage and 6 years of widowhood. I bought myself a car. Not a practical, sensible car chosen for its reliability and resale value. Not a car approved by committee or selected based on someone else's needs and preferences. I bought a bright red Honda CR-V with heated seats, a sunroof, and a premium sound system that I absolutely didn't need, but wanted anyway. Mrs. Chen came with me to the dealership, and when the young salesman assumed she was my daughter and began directing his pitch toward her, I cleared my throat and spoke with the voice of a woman who was no longer invisible. "I'm the one buying the car," I said firmly. "She's here for moral support and to drive me home if I decide to purchase today." The salesman's face went through several expressions before settling on respectful attention. For the first time in years, someone was listening to what I wanted rather than telling me what I needed. I paid cash, the whole amount up front, without asking anyone's opinion or worrying about whether the money might be better spent on someone else's priorities. The freedom of making a purely selfish financial decision was intoxicating. Driving home through the streets of Chicago in my beautiful red car, with the sunroof open and classical music playing at exactly the volume I preferred, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated, unapologetic joy. Mrs. Chen had been watching this transformation with the quiet satisfaction of someone who recognized the process of a person reclaiming their own life. "You know," she said that evening as we sat in her garden with glasses of wine, another small pleasure I'd rediscovered, "when my Harold died, everyone told me I should be grateful that Jennifer wanted me to move in with her family." I looked at her with surprise. Mrs. Chen had never mentioned having a daughter, and in the 3 weeks I'd been staying with her, no family members had visited or called. "I almost did it," she continued, swirling the wine in her glass thoughtfully. "I was so scared of being alone, so convinced that I needed to be taken care of, that I almost gave up this house and my independence to become someone's burden." "What stopped you?" "A conversation with my neighbor, a woman about your age whose daughter had convinced her to sell her home and move in for her own good. I watched this vibrant, independent woman turn into a shadow of herself within 6 months. She went from hosting bridge parties and tending her garden to sitting in a corner of someone else's living room, trying to make herself small enough not to be noticed." Mrs. Chen took a sip of her wine and looked at me with clear, intelligent eyes. That's when I realized that being alone wasn't the worst thing that could happen to me. Being diminished was worse. Being grateful for scraps of attention was worse. Being afraid to take up space in my own life was worse. "Do you ever regret it? Not moving in with Jennifer?" "Jennifer and I have a wonderful relationship now," Mrs. Chen said with a smile. "She visits every few months, we take trips together sometimes, and when she calls, it's because she wants to talk to me, not because she needs something from me. That's what relationships look like when they're based on choice rather than obligation." The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called the community college and asked about their continuing education programs. "What kind of courses interest you?" the admissions counselor asked. For 43 years, I'd sublimated my interests to Harold's preferences and family obligations. For 6 years after that, I'd been too focused on survival and service to remember what I enjoyed for its own sake. "Art history," I said, the words coming from some buried part of myself that I'd forgotten existed. "I've always wanted to study art history." The class met twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, in a bright classroom filled with students ranging in age from 19 to 82. Professor Williams was a passionate woman in her 50s who treated every painting, sculpture, and architectural wonder as if she were introducing us to her closest friends. The first night, when she asked us to introduce ourselves and explain why we were taking the class, I found myself speaking with a confidence that surprised me. "I'm Margaret Jennings," I said, standing beside my desk like the proper student I'd never had the chance to be. "I'm 77 years old, and I'm here because I've spent most of my life taking care of other people's dreams. Now, I want to explore some of my own." The room fell silent for a moment, and then a woman about my age in the back row started clapping. Soon the entire class was applauding, and I felt tears on my cheeks that had nothing to do with sadness. After class, 3 of my classmates approached me. Susan, who was recently divorced at 68 and learning to live alone for the first time in 45 years. Patricia, who was 82 and auditing classes because she'd always regretted not finishing college when she was young. And Michael, who was 74 and had started taking art history classes after his wife died because she'd always wanted to visit the great museums of Europe and he was planning to go in her honor. "Would you like to get coffee?" Susan asked. "There's a place down the street that stays open late." I looked at these people who had approached me not because they needed something from me, but because they enjoyed my company, and I felt that unfamiliar sensation of joy bubbling up in my chest again. "I'd love to," I said. We stayed until the coffee shop closed, talking about art and life and the strange freedom that comes with reaching an age where other people's opinions matter less than your own peace of mind. When we finally parted ways in the parking lot, Patricia hugged me goodbye. "Same time Thursday?" she asked. "Absolutely," I replied, and meant it. The changes weren't just external. I began to notice subtle shifts in how I moved through the world, how I spoke to people, how I made decisions. When the grocery store clerk seemed harried and overwhelmed, I offered her a genuine smile and asked how her day was going. Not because I needed something from her, but because I remembered what it felt like to be invisible to people you were serving. When the bank teller apologized for the wait, I told her it was no problem and that I appreciated her patience in helping me understand my new account arrangements, not because I was being polite, but because I meant it. When Mrs. Chen's handyman mentioned that his elderly mother was struggling with loneliness after moving to a senior living facility, I asked for her address and wrote her a letter, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Small acts of genuine kindness, freely given, felt completely different from the obligatory service I'd been providing for years. The phone calls from David became less frequent and more careful. The desperation had faded into something that might have been respect, or at least wariness. He no longer demanded that I come home or accused me of abandoning the family. Instead, he asked how I was doing and listened to my answers as if they mattered. "Mom," he said during one of our brief conversations, "Marissa wants to apologize for what she said at the library, about the legal stuff. She can apologize to me herself if she chooses to," I replied calmly. "But David, an apology isn't an eraser. It doesn't undo 6 years of taking me for granted." "I know. We know. We're trying to figure out how to manage things differently." "Good. Learning to live within your means is an important life skill." There was a pause, and then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. Would you be willing to have dinner with us sometime? Just to talk? When you're ready to have a conversation about how we can build a relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence, call me, I said. "But David, I'm not coming back to fix your problems or fund your lifestyle. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be because you value me as a person, not as a resource." "I understand," he said, and for the first time in years, I thought he might actually mean it. Rebecca called me that Saturday afternoon, her voice bright with excitement. "Grandma Margaret, guess what? I made the honor roll and I joined the debate team, and I learned how to make pancakes by myself. That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. And Grandma, I've been thinking about what you said at the library, about how people should value each other. I think I understand now." "What do you understand, honey?" "That loving someone means treating them like they matter, not just saying you love them." I closed my eyes and felt something in my chest that had been tight for 6 years finally loosen completely. "That's exactly right, Rebecca. You're a very wise young lady. Will you come to my debate tournament next month? I know things are complicated with Mom and Dad, but I'd really like you to be there." I looked around Mrs. Chen's peaceful living room, at the art books I'd been studying for class scattered on the coffee table, at the travel brochures I'd picked up for a trip to Italy I was planning for the spring. "I'd be honored to come to your debate tournament," I said. "And Rebecca, you don't have to choose between loving me and loving your parents. Family relationships are complicated, but the love you feel for people is yours to give freely. I love you, Grandma. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." After I hung up, I sat in the afternoon sunlight streaming through Mrs. Chen's windows and realized that for the first time in years, I was looking forward to tomorrow. Not because I had obligations to fulfill or people to serve, but because I had a life to live, and I was finally remembering how to live it on my own terms. 6 months later, I stood in the Louvre Museum in Paris, holding an audio guide in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, staring at the Mona Lisa with tears streaming down my face. Not because of the painting's beauty, though it was breathtaking in person. I was crying because 6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined that I would ever be brave enough to travel alone to a foreign country, confident enough to navigate unfamiliar streets, or wealthy enough to afford such a trip after protecting my assets from people who'd been draining them for years. The woman standing next to me, a fellow American tourist about my age, noticed my tears and offered me a tissue. "Overwhelming, isn't it?" she said kindly. "I cried when I saw it too. It's not just the painting," I admitted, accepting the tissue gratefully. "It's everything. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I was nothing more than what I could provide for other people." She studied my face with the recognition of someone who'd perhaps walked a similar path. And now? I looked around the museum, at the art I'd been studying in my classes, at the tourists from dozens of countries who'd all made the journey to see these masterpieces, at the life I'd built for myself from the ashes of my demolished expectations. Now I know that I was wrong. I wasn't nothing. I was just sleeping. The trip to Paris had been planned with Susan, Patricia, and Michael from my art history class. But at the last minute, Susan's daughter had convinced her that international travel was too dangerous for someone her age, and Patricia had developed a minor health issue that her son insisted required constant monitoring. I could have canceled. 6 months ago, I would have canceled, using their absence as proof that I wasn't brave enough or capable enough to manage such an adventure alone. Instead, I'd boarded the plane by myself, checked into my small hotel near the Latin Quarter, and spent 5 days wandering through museums and cafes and gardens with the freedom of someone who finally understood that solitude and loneliness were completely different experiences. The evening before my flight home, I sat in a sidewalk cafe watching Parisians hurry past on their way to dinners and meetings, and lives that had nothing to do with me, and I felt more connected to the world than I had in years. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca. "How's Paris, Grandma? Can't wait to see your pictures." I smiled and took a photo of my wine glass with the Eiffel Tower glowing in the background, then typed back, "Paris is magical, but I can't wait to come home and tell you about everything I've learned." And I meant it. For the first time in years, I was eager to return home, not because I was escaping something, but because I had stories to share with people who genuinely wanted to hear them. The flight back to Chicago gave me 8 hours to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed. The woman sitting in the window seat next to me was about 40 years old, traveling with her elderly mother who seemed confused and agitated by the airport crowds and airplane noise. I watched the daughter's patience wear thin as her mother repeatedly asked the same questions, dropped her purse, and struggled with the airplane seatbelt. The familiar dynamic of caregiver exhaustion and elderly dependence was painful to witness. During a moment when the older woman dozed, her daughter turned to me with the desperate look of someone drowning in obligations. "I'm sorry if she's bothering you," she whispered. "Mom has early-stage dementia, and travel is really hard for her. But she insisted on visiting my sister in California. She's not bothering me at all," I assured her. "In fact, I think it's wonderful that you're helping her maintain her connections with family. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing. My sister thinks Mom should be in assisted living already. And my brother thinks I'm enabling her by continuing to take her on trips like this." I looked at the sleeping woman, her face peaceful now that the stress of travel had temporarily lifted, and then back at her daughter's worried expression. "Can I tell you something I've learned recently?" I asked gently. "There's a difference between helping someone because you love them and helping someone because you feel obligated to. The first creates connection. The second creates resentment." She blinked at me in surprise. "How do you tell the difference? Ask yourself, am I doing this because it brings me joy to bring joy to someone I love? Or am I doing this because I'm afraid of what people will think if I don't?" The daughter was quiet for a long moment, considering my question. I think I do it because I love her. Because when she smiles and thanks me, I remember who she used to be before the disease started taking her away. Then you're doing the right thing, I said firmly. Love freely given is never a mistake. When we landed in Chicago, I helped them collect their luggage and watched them reunite with family members who greeted both women with obvious affection and gratitude. The difference between that scene and my own experiences 6 months earlier was stark and instructive. Mrs. Chen picked me up at the airport, her face bright with excitement to hear about my adventures. "How was it?" she asked, as we drove through the familiar streets of our neighborhood. "Life-changing," I said simply. "I never imagined I could feel so comfortable being alone in a foreign country." "That's because you've learned the difference between being alone and being lonely," she observed. "You were lonely surrounded by family who didn't appreciate you. Now you're content in your own company." Back in her guest room, which had somehow become simply my room during my absence, I unpacked my souvenirs and reflected on the message that had been waiting for me. David had called while I was traveling, leaving a voicemail that I listened to 3 times before I fully absorbed its meaning. "Mom, it's David. I know you're in Paris and I hope you're having an amazing time. I wanted you to know that Marissa and I have been in counseling, talking about how we treated you and how we want to do better. We've also been working with a financial advisor to learn how to manage our money without depending on help from family. When you're ready, we'd love to take you to dinner and show you that we've learned how to appreciate what we have instead of always wanting more. But there's no pressure. I just wanted you to know that we understand now what we lost when we lost your respect. I love you, Mom." The message was followed by one from Rebecca. "Grandma, I won my debate tournament. The topic was about family values, and I talked about how love should be freely given, not purchased. I hope you're proud of me." I sat on the bed I'd bought for myself, not borrowed, not tolerated, but chosen and owned, and felt a completeness I'd never experienced before. The doorbell rang that evening as Mrs. Chen and I were finishing dinner. Through the window, I could see a small figure on the front porch. Rebecca stood there alone, holding a wrapped package and wearing the nervous expression of someone who wasn't sure of their welcome. "Hi, Grandma," she said when I opened the door. "Mom drove me here, but she's waiting in the car. I wanted to give you this by myself." I looked past her to see Marissa sitting in their SUV, making no move to get out or approach the house. "Come in, sweetheart," I said, stepping aside to let Rebecca enter. The package contained a photo album she'd made herself, filled with pictures of our time together over the years. But these weren't the formal family photos that had been relegated to the basement. These were candid shots of us baking cookies, reading stories, working in the garden, moments when we'd been genuinely connected, rather than just occupying the same space. On the last page, she'd written in her careful 12-year-old handwriting, "Thank you for teaching me that love means respecting people, not using them. I hope someday I'm as brave as you." I hugged her tightly, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and feeling the fierce love that had never wavered despite everything that had happened between the adults in her life. "You're already brave, Rebecca. Braver than you know." When she left, I waved to Marissa from the porch. She raised her hand in a tentative wave back. Not friendly, but not hostile either. Progress, of a sort. That night, as I prepared for bed in my own space, surrounded by my own things, with plans for tomorrow that reflected my own preferences, I thought about the question people had been asking me for months. "Aren't you lonely?" The answer was complex but important. Yes. Sometimes I missed the sound of children's laughter in the hallways. Yes, sometimes I wished I had someone to share my daily experiences with. Yes, sometimes the silence felt too complete. But loneliness with dignity was infinitely preferable to companionship without respect. And I'd discovered that solitude could be peaceful rather than painful when it was chosen rather than imposed. I'd also learned that family love was supposed to be freely given and freely received, not purchased with sacrifice and maintained through obligation. Most importantly, I'd learned that it's never too late to remember your own worth, set boundaries that protect your well-being, and choose relationships that nourish rather than drain you. 6 months ago, I was a woman who measured her value by what she could provide for others. Tonight, I'm a woman who knows her worth has nothing to do with her usefulness and everything to do with her inherent dignity as a human being who deserves love, respect, and kindness, especially from herself. The woman in the mirror looked back at me with clear eyes and a peaceful expression, And for the first time in years, I liked what I saw. Tomorrow, I would call David and accept his invitation to dinner, not because I needed to fix our relationship, but because I was curious to see what it might look like when it was built on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. And if it didn't work out, if they hadn't truly changed, if they were still looking for what I could provide rather than who I was, I would be okay. Because I'd learned the most important lesson of all. I was enough, exactly as I was, with or without their approval. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you were giving everything to people who appreciated nothing? Do you know someone who might be buying love instead of receiving it freely? Tell me in the comments below if this story resonated with your own experience or someone you care about. If this message touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Sometimes the stories we need to hear most are the ones that remind us we're not alone in our struggles, and that it's never too late to choose dignity over convenience, respect over obligation, and authentic love over purchased affection. Thank you for listening to Margaret's story. May it remind you that your worth has nothing to do with what you can do for others, and everything to do with who you are.